we have looked at the Bible's accuracy when it comes to things like history and archaeology and geography so far. We've also found that when it talks about people and kings and nations and cities and things like that, it's true time after time, right? We've had a lot of evidence so far that shows that. And often we find now, especially nowadays, that historians and archaeologists actually rely on the Old Testament specifically in certain places and on Luke, in both Luke and Acts, for their accuracy in finding certain things and knowing certain things exist and the details they can rely on. What we said was, and of course, in this part of these lessons, we're trying to find out, is the Bible reliable? Is it actually one of or the thing that shows us that the mind that we talked about in the first part is actually the mind of God? What we're doing at this point is we're trying to find out whether the Bible is it within the realm of fiction or nonfiction, because there's a lot of people nowadays that think the Bible is a great book, but that the Bible is a fiction book. It's a book of myths. But we've looked at a massive amount of information that shows that it's nonfiction. And if the Bible's nonfiction, then it's really, really difficult to say at the same time that it's a myth like everybody else does. All right? We're going to continue on with that somewhat today. So we've looked at these particular kinds of areas so far, and we found that the Bible points to the fact that what it says is historically and archaeologically and everything else is true. It's got so many of these things. What I brought up so far is actually very small compared to the overall amount of this information. You can buy books on Bible archaeology, and there's massive amounts of information in it. But are there other areas where the evidence in the Bible seems to point towards the fact that it was written by somebody outside of space and time, like God that claims to have written its pages? What we're going to look at today are two other areas. We're going to look at the field of medicine with some examples and the field of science with some examples. Now, keep in mind, the Bible is not a book of archaeology. It's not a book of history. That is not its purpose. We're going to get to its purpose later on. And it is not a medical book, and it is not a science book. But what we're looking for is evidence that shows when the Bible talks about these things, it knows what it's talking about. Contrary, as we talked about last week, to a lot of other religions that have books that do not do this. And I think it's a reason why, personally, God wrote the book the way he did. Not only to tell us the story that we need to know, but as proof at the same time that it was written by somebody outside of space and time. Too many people miss that. The message of the book is about a promised seed. But when it speaks of these other things, even in passing, they're correct. So, here we go today. Put gazelle dung on and mice urine and use those, mix them together for pest control. Mix flour and incense and use that for headaches. Red lead, goose grease, and ginger for an eye condition. Blood from a black calf boiled in oil, or you could use rattlesnake fat for gray hair. And the final one I got listed here is worm's blood and donkey dung is what you put on a splinter to try to fix it. Any idea where these come from? You do. I bet you do. All right? They come from this document here. Now, this is not all of it. This is part of it. It's called the Papyrus Ebers. Ebers, I think. Ebers. And what it is the medical remedies that were the most reputable medical guide known to man at the time in 1500 BC. And this is at who lived approximately 1500 BC in the Bible. Real important guy. Wrote Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Moses, okay? So we're saying it in this context because we're talking, most of the medical stuff we're going to talk about comes from Moses, and make a comparison to other practices of his day and other practices even of more modern times. All right? That's our goal. These are some other medical practices that were commonplace even not that long ago. Anybody have any idea why? When you go to a barber shop, at least it used to be, they're not so much anymore, they had a red and white pole. Now this one has blue stripes also, and it's the nicest one I could find, but for a while they only had red and white stripes. Nobody?
I used to know.
It's because the barber was also the doctor. Okay? He would do the stitching up, he would set the arm, and the most important thing that he did was, if somebody came in with an ailment and they thought the blood was bad, it was his razor knife that he would shave people with, that he would cut people open and bleed them to get out the bad blood. Common practice at the time. Very common. In fact, history claims that George Washington, that's how he died. Somebody bled him and they bled him too much. All right? This was common right up through parts of the later 1800s. All right? Not that long before I was born. I was born in 1951. So 50 years before me, there were still people, before I was born, there were still probably people bleeding people. All right? Some of these common practices we look back at today and we think they're nonsense. Another one that was common in the 1840s in Vienna, this is kind of a drawing of the most prestigious hospital in the world at the time. It was in Vienna, Austria. And each morning in this hospital, they took the medical students into the morgue, right? What they do in the morgue, they would teach the students how to dissect a dead body, see the organs, find out why the guy died, all that kind of stuff. And you can imagine that when you're digging around in a dead body, that your hands get kind of icky, right? And they get diseased. Well, what the next thing that the students did on their round was they went into the maternity ward. And they never washed their hands in between. And they wondered why, in this prestigious hospital, a large percentage of pregnant women were dying. They did not know why. There was a guy named Ignaz Semmelweis, all right? I think that's how you pronounce his name. In the 1840s, he was working at that hospital in Vienna. He discovered that if he washed his hands after performing those autopsies, and then before examining the women, that the mortality rate went down and the women lived through their childbirth. At first, most of his colleagues thought he was crazy. Okay? They didn't have anything to do with it. In fact, they say that this guy ended up dying just before this became known in the hospital, because he was going crazy and he was in an institution, and it broke the man because he knew he was right and they all opposed him because they didn't want to wash their hands. But let's take a look at a few things from the Old Testament that show us that if they were paying attention to what the Bible said, not about medical practice per se, but was things that were being told to Moses for various reasons, they should have known what they were doing was wrong. in all these situations. All right? Now, I'm going to emphasize that the things I'm going to read about in the Old Testament are ceremonially important to the Messiah. So the purpose is not a medical dictionary. The purpose is, number one, to give us a symbolic idea of what the Messiah was when he came, and secondary was, this is a good practice that you need to do because otherwise you're going to have diseases, all right? Unfortunately, some people turn that around and they don't see the second or see the first one, they only see the second. So I want to emphasize that. Numbers chapter 19, verse 11. Whoever touches a human corpse will be unclean. Pretty plain and simple. All right? And then it goes on to say, whoops, we'll get to that in a second. Guess I'm not down quite that far. How did Moses know to write this practice of cleansing several thousand years before modern medicine realized they needed to do it? That's an important question to ask, because in various other verses throughout the Old Testament, there are lots of examples where it says, if you're unclean in this situation, then you go bathe yourself, you go wash your hands, you do this, you do these hygiene practices. And again, I'm going to emphasize, there is a parallel of these hygiene practices to the Messiah. And that's the most important part of it. But they're good hygiene practices. At the same time, God didn't waste space by telling it twice. This is the medical reason, this is the Messiah reason. He just said it. But the point is, common people throughout, even up to recent times, didn't believe certain things that the Bible said should be plain. And here's what's another one that's interesting. Moses also wrote what to do with waste products. We just mentioned the fact that they would put donkey dung and worm's blood on a splinter. And then why did all these people die of end up with lockjaw? All right? They couldn't figure that out. The Egyptians, the ancient Egyptians. The question is, when he wrote about these things, for instance, the Deuteronomy chapter 23 says, designate a place outside the camp where you can go to relieve yourself. As part of your equipment, have a shovel to dig a hole and cover it up. All right? There's a lot of places in history where they didn't do that sort of practice. It just emptied into a stream, and then they wondered why diseases came to people downstream from where everything was being dumped in. True. There were plagues that were started this way. Massive ones. But it's interesting to note that Moses had been schooled by what great nation? Where did Moses live his first 40 years?
Egypt.
Do you think he would have learned the medical practices of Egypt? I mean, he was raised in Pharaoh's house. He was a sophisticated person. He was no slouch. Even though he was Jewish, they hid that, or they pretended like he wasn't. But he was educated in the finest schools of Egypt at the time, under Pharaoh, because Pharaoh considered him his son. Where did Moses, let's go to this. What did Moses do for the next 40 years of his life? After remember he ran out of Egypt because he had killed an Egyptian, and the people of Israel were against him because it looked like they were going to get in trouble, so Moses fled. Where'd he go? Don't remember. He went to a land of Midian, which was a long ways away, out in the desert, and became a sheep herder for 40 years. Now, Moses is 80 years old when he gets out of doing that, goes back to Egypt. He's been educated by the Pharaoh. He's been educated on how to be a sheep herder, and these people are backwards, and they don't have necessarily the best practices. And he comes, when he's 80 years old, does the plagues, does all this, Israel's out, and then he starts writing these books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and it's got this math and science stuff in it that nobody at the time knows. And some of it, nobody knows for 1,000 years or 2,000 years afterwards, or more. Okay? How did Moses know? Remember, the Bible's not a medical book, and the primary purpose when Moses wrote was not to be a doctor. It was just, as we will see later, in part of this class later, these kinds of passages were written in the Old Testament for the purpose of symbolically pointing to the promised seed. The idea of becoming clean translates to what happens to those who accept Jesus as Christ and become his followers. But at the same time, the practices that Moses wrote were sound information and correct in the medical field, in the scientific field, as we'll see in just a second. God showed us how important we are to him by sending his son. Jesus became a blood sacrifice for our sins. The practice of bloodletting that we saw in the 1700s and even into the 1800s that we just mentioned shows that people of that time did not know the Bible as they should, because this idea of blood being important is revealed in Leviticus chapter 17, verse 11. For the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it for you upon the altar. And this second part here, it's talking about future telling, so to speak, how the blood's going to be important for sacrifice, all right? Which ends up being both immediately, of course, with the animal sacrifices that they did in the Old Testament, but pointing further to the sacrifice that would be when his son came. But the life of the flesh is in the blood. That's an important statement that they ignored for a lot of years. So we see in this case that the science is correct. Their predictions of a blood atonement for God, the seed, is also correct. In Exodus chapter 15, verse 26, it says, if you will diligently hearken to the voice of the Lord your God and do that which is right in his eyes and give heed to his commandments and keep his statutes, I will put none of these diseases upon you that I have put on the Egyptians. In other words, I'm going to keep you safer than the Egyptians could, because you're going to follow the things. Not only ceremonially, but these other practices are going to be a benefit to you. You're not going to get the diseases that they get. So, those are just a few of the medical practices. There's actually a book out that talks about a lot more of these, written by a doctor. But these are enough to show us that Moses somehow knew some things that could not have been known by him in the training that he had. Let's look at a few things from science now. Many make the claim that the Bible is a myth and that when it comes to science, Scripture is incorrect. For instance, I read an article recently that assumed that the Bible said that the earth was flat. And they pointed to two scriptures from the Old Testament. No, one from the Old Testament, one from the New Testament. The first one was Isaiah chapter 24, 1. See, the Lord is going to lay waste to the earth and devastate it, and he will ruin its face and scatter its inhabitants. How does that say that the earth is flat? I don't even know where they get that from by that passage.
My first thought is its face.
Yeah, that's the only thing I'm thinking of.
A sphere.
So they're thinking of a face like when the proper term for these parts of a cube are faces, and it's flat. That's the only thing I can, yeah, that came to mind too, but I think that's pretty thin. I don't know what you think, but I think that's pretty thin.
I don't agree.
Here's the other one they mentioned. The devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their splendor. Which, supposedly, I guess, they're thinking that if he's, up this high on top of this temple pillar, that he can see everything because the earth's flat and there's no curvature. No. Okay? That's not what these are saying. I think it is a pretty big stretch to get this information out of those passages. The Bible rarely speaks about science or in scientific terms, but that's because its purpose is not to be a science book. But when it does, I think it's more accurate than these guys are trying to say. For instance, in ancient times, there were all kinds of ways in which ancient people thought that the world was held up. All right? One of the more famous ones was a guy named Atlas. The Greeks depicted the world being held up by Atlas on his shoulders. Right? And that's I don't know if that's how ancient that is. It looks like it's pretty old. But that's one of the things that they thought. The Chinese and the Hindus had another belief that the earth was actually floating along on the back of a turtle. And then others didn't think that that was enough, so they had the turtle, and then they had elephants on the back of the turtle, and then they had the earth on top of that. All right? So I remember John Clayton saying this is actually the perfect one for ancient people because they didn't know the earth was round. And the second thing is that if there was a monsoon and the turtle went underneath the water, if there was rain, then the elephants would drink the water and spray it up on top of the land. And if they moved too much, there was an earthquake. So, no. But the problem is, the Bible says things that are along a different line. There are long sections of the book of Job where he and his friends are debating over why God seems to be punishing Job. And one of these is in chapter 26. Job challenges his friends right back and then focuses on praising God and his power. And then in chapter 26, verse 7, he says this. He spreads out the northern sky over empty space. He suspends the earth on nothing. We're going to look at, first of all, the second half of this. He suspends the earth on nothing. Doesn't suspend the earth like common belief at the time that it was on an elephant or it was on a turtle or if it was on one of the gods that held it up. It's suspended on nothing. Again, Job was written very long ago. They don't have an exact date, but it's possible Job was written back during the time of Genesis, right? Or is about a guy that lived back at the time of Genesis. Very, very old, like maybe pre-Abraham. Nobody knows for sure, but he's not modern by no means, all right? And yet, even back at that time, and at the time when Job was being written or passed down in whatever way it got to us, he knew that it was suspended on nothing, or he wouldn't have been able to say that. The second part of this that's important is I lost my place because I've been free thinking here. Let me give you an idea. Oh, there we go. Job is not being a scientist, all right? We just said that. By the way, notice the beginning of the verse, all right? He spreads out the northern skies over empty space. I think at that time, people might have even been wondering why Job said what he said. But he was correct. We notice at the beginning of the verse that he's talking about this empty sky, but it wasn't actually discovered until 1981. I was well out of college, all right? I was married by then when a guy named Kishner discovered, this is one of the pictures, that in the northern sky there's an empty spot where there's no stars. It's common knowledge now, but it wasn't common knowledge until my lifetime. But somehow or another, Job knew that. How did Job know that? All right, we got more. Most ancient cultures believed that the earth was not round. And there's quite a few different examples of this. We're going to look at a few in just a second here. And they could not conceive of the fact that it could be day and night at the same time in other parts around the world, because people didn't travel from one place to another. All right? That didn't happen until quite a bit later. Here's some examples of the kinds of maps at various times in history. This is from 500 BC, Babylonian map. You can see the map down here, and it's flat. This is a map from 600 BC. It's a map that was done by this Greek guy, Anaximander. And you can see it's got the Mediterranean, it's got the Black Sea, it's got places like Libya and Asia and Europe. You could get from one to another because you didn't have to cross a major ocean. And it's flat. It's got a circle to it, but it's still flat. Now this one's from the 12th century AD. Okay, 1100s, and it's still a flat map of what the world looks like at the time. Now this might be a shocker, but this one is from 1893. Columbus has already sailed America. Magellan has already sailed around the world, and yet there were still people at the time, just 58 years before I was born, that were still drawing maps like this, thinking that the earth was not a globe. Okay? What do all these maps have in common? They all assume that the earth was flat. But this is what the Bible says in Isaiah chapter 40, verse 22. He sits enthroned above the circle of the earth. And then we move on to the New Testament and a statement made by Jesus that doesn't seem odd to us today, but it would seem curious to people back at this time. I tell you that on that night, he's talking about Jesus coming, and we could get into what he means by that specifically in another class. But he's talking about a specific night when something's going to happen. Jesus is going to be coming. Two people will be in one bed. One will be taken and the other one will be left. Two women will be grinding grain together. One will be taken and one will be left. Now, we emphasize, rightfully so, that there will be people that will be left and will be taken. And that's what we usually talk about in a class. But notice that on that same night, we got some people in bed and we got some people out during the daytime grinding grain. Simultaneously. In the same day. All right? What does that mean? That means someplace it's day and someplace it's night on the same moment. They didn't believe that at this time because nobody had been to both sides of the world. Make sense? Somehow Jesus knew that it was. Now notice Jesus is going to say, the reason they can do this is because the world is a globe and there's sun's coming down on this side and it's shining on this side, but it's not on this side, so it's dark. So these people would be in bed, and he doesn't go into that. It doesn't matter to him because they wouldn't have understood that anyway. That wasn't his point. But like with all of these, when it comes up in a conversation, it is written about accurately, and it's not emphasized as the most important part. but it's not wrong. Even though all of the cultures at the time when these things were written were wrong about these things. This is Ferdinand Magellan, when he sailed 5 ships from Spain all the way around the world. That wasn't until 1519 to 1522. It took him about 3 years or so. This is the path that they know he took. Started out from Spain and wrapped all the way around the world. That was the first time it was proven. No, this was just a few years, 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, right? He'd been to the Americas and back a couple of times. But a few years later, Magellan said, I think we can go farther, and finally he went all the way around the world, and that was a big shocker. But even by the 1800s, there were people that didn't believe it. Now we can know for sure, unless they're lying to us about space shots, but you're taking a picture of it, right? So the Bible is ahead of its time, telling the truth. People are trying to catch up and saying that the Bible is a myth. That's where I sometimes have to chuckle. The next thing I want to look at is the quarantine. You know what a quarantine is? You know what a quarantine is? Tell me.
When you're close, you have to stay in one spot.
Yeah, you have to stay in one spot, usually because you got some kind of disease that's highly contagious and nobody wants to touch you or breathe your air, right? Quarantine. It's important now. But quarantine began just before the 1400s, during probably the time of the Black Plague. So people before that time didn't quarantine, all right? In fact, this is from an article from Oxford, and it says the following: quarantines were denounced in the 1800s as spaces that worsened the socioeconomic health. In other words, they were bad. They weren't good for you. This is the 1800s. Some anti-contagiousists, people that didn't believe that things were contagious, even believed that when it came to epidemics, the unhealthy and dangerous buildings of the quarantine station were actually the root of the diseases. They thought it was the building's fault for putting people in quarantine. Rather than being imported, they argued that epidemics were born in such stations, in other words, the rooms, due to the lack of air, light, and hygiene. They thought that quarantining a person was absurd, just like washing a hand before you go in from dead bodies to, right? It wasn't until 1912. Now you're talking. My dad was born in 1928, so 16 years before my dad was born, that the Multilateral International Sanitary Convention in Paris, which was a big deal at the time, evidently, decided that every country should adopt rules that govern quarantine. But the problem is that throughout Exodus, Moses emphasized the importance of isolating various diseases and limiting contact under various conditions. How did Moses know about quarantines and that it was important? It's scattered throughout mostly the book of Leviticus, but there's some also in a couple of the other books. And I didn't put a specific chapter on verse in here because there was too many of them. But just a casual reading will see that you're supposed to quarantine. The next one. The creation sequence in Genesis chapter 1. After the earth was formed, what was created first?
Atlas.
Okay. What was second?
Fish.
Water creatures. What was third?
Were the birds and the beasts made on the same day?
Birds.
Okay.
Things that fly. And what was next?
Beasts of the land.
Mammals, beasts of the land. And fifth was man. All right? Here is the order according to New Science, article 2009. Plants, water creatures, birds, mammals, man. That hasn't always been known. And like we just said, this is the same order, Genesis chapter 1, verses 11, 20, 21, 25, 26. The exact same order. It agrees with the New Science article of 2009, and yet they say that the Bible is fiction. You get the idea that they're not being consistent here? All right? Let's move on to another. In an article in Scientists Reveal Evidence called Scientists Reveal Evidence Adam and Eve Really Existed. This is of January 5th, 2025, so it's just a couple months ago, by a guy named William Hunter. He says this: it might come as a surprise to learn that scientists really do believe that all living humans are descended from a single woman. Now, the article goes on, and it makes another statement later on, and it actually makes a bunch of statements in the article that make the claim that you have to forget about the serpent, you have to forget about the eating the fruit, you have to forget about the Garden of Eden, and you have to forget, all this stuff, other stuff in there is wrong. But the idea of man coming from, all men coming from one woman, science is saying that's true. And then they go on and they say this: chances are that most female lineages will eventually come to an end. So they're not throwing out the fact that there were other women who's had a whole bunch of people descended from them, and then that whole group of people died off. But this particular one continues on to today. You see what I'm saying? I'm trying to make sure I'm saying this correctly. Question? What I mean? Okay. I wasn't sure if you understood what I meant. This means that there were other human ancestors that lived long before, but they died off without a trace. What does that do? That still allows them to have this evolutionary thing happening over millions and millions of years. But since there's not a trace of them now, there's no way to prove or disprove it. There's actually a name for it. I don't know if I can pronounce it. It's called mitochondrial Eve. It's a theory. On that video titled Mother of Humanity, it makes the claim that this mitochondrial Eve, this person that everybody is descended from now, scientific paper, get this, that she must have lived between 5,000 and 10,000 years ago. Come on. They're not putting all their information together in one source. And one guy's got a piece over here, another guy's got a piece over here, but they all want to believe this instead. So these are never connected together to say, look, the Bible's not a book of myths, it's telling the truth. See where I'm going with this? All right. Here's another one. There is such a thing as what's known as water cycles, where they're around the globe. And what we have is paths that the water goes, air, rivers, lakes, oceans, as well as under the ground. But ancient people did not know this. And it wasn't until 1580, when this guy named Palissy discovered what is the modern theory of water cycles. But the concept was not accepted until, again, the early 1800s. Ancient cultures didn't believe this. Ancient cultures thought that gods poured water on the land continuously. Someplace it was raining, and the gods were pouring the water down on the land. All right? That's where the water came from. But we know now that because of this guy's work and other work that came after him, that the water is constantly being recycled all the way around the earth, right? In different ways, in different places. If that's true, then how did the writer of Ecclesiastes, Solomon, know that all streams flow into the sea, yet the sea is never full? To the place of the streams come from, they return again. How did he know that? How did Job know that he draws up the drops of water which distill as rain? You realize distilling process for water is it goes up, the contaminants stay down because they're heavier, and then when it rains, the water's pure, right? That's exactly what he's saying here. There's this process where the waters are going through a cycle, and he's telling them in this. The clouds pour down their moisture, and abundant showers fall on mankind. How did Job and Solomon know these things when they were not common practice until at least the 1800s? They weren't common knowledge. This is a guy named Herbert Spencer, right? Pretty famous scientist. He lived 1820 to 1903, so he died about 20 years before my dad was born. And there was a lot of things that he is known for, but he's known for what's called his scientific principles, fundamental scientific principles. And those scientific principles are that there is time, force, action, space, and matter. And they happen in that order. And they're all important. Any idea where we see those exact things in the Bible? Any idea? Try the first verse of the Bible. In the beginning, time. God, force, created, action. The heavens, space, and earth, matter. It's the beginning of the Bible. Are you getting the idea that not only is the Bible correct when it talks about archaeology, when it talks about history, when it talks about people, places, kings, battles, but it's also very, very accurate when it talks about medicine, it talks about science. We haven't even gotten into it, and I don't think I'm going to spend the time, but the things that Luke talks about, we talked about Luke a lot last week, the things that Luke talks about, Luke was a doctor. And when he talks about these things, he talks about them very, very accurately. And it's important that he does, because it adds to more of this. So far we know, we've shown, hopefully the Bible is a story. It's a book of nonfiction. When it speaks of history, it's true. When it speaks of archaeology, it's true. When it speaks of people, places, nations, kings, and events, it's true. And when it speaks of medical practices, it's ahead of its time. And when it speaks of science, it's correct. Does any of this prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that the Bible was written by God himself? No, it doesn't. Just like anything we talked about in the previous class does not prove that evolution is false and the Bible is true. But what did we say was important? We look at the evidence and we mount it up and see which direction the evidence points. There's the direction I think we need to go. And we're getting an awful lot of evidence in the idea that evolution is not true. We've done that in the first part. And now we're accumulating evidence that the Bible is actually accurate in such a way where I think it could be the right book. We're going to talk more about that starting next week. Anybody ever studied, we talk about some prophecies in Isaiah about Jesus, and we talk about, some other things like that, but have you ever studied the predictions that were made by the prophets about Egypt, about Tyre and Sidon, about Babylonia, about Assyria, a bunch of these ancient nations? When they were disobeying God and they were persecuting God's people, the prophets would make predictions about what would happen to these nations. The Bible never tells us whether these predictions came true, but there's a guy that has a book that went through historically and found what happened to each one of these nations and compared that with what the predictions were made by the prophets in the Old Testament. We're going to spend at least 2 weeks talking about that, starting next week. And I think you're going to find that it's amazing how these prophecies, very specific, the prophecies that were made about Egypt were not the same as what was made about Babylonia, not the same as ones that were made about Syria. They're all different. They all caused the eventual ruin of those nations, but they're very specific things that happen that are different than every other. And when you look at history, guess what? We're going to find out. It all happened the way that the Old Testament prophets said it was going to happen. And it was hundreds or even thousands of years later that it happened. Right? That's what we're going to start next week for at least a couple of weeks.